and thank you everyone for coming to Learning Ideas Conference. Our first speaker in this 3:30 session is Joshua Friedman. So this presentation proposes a dynamic process model for thinking about social interactions in the classroom. This model can be used as a tool to diagnose, analyze, predict, and facilitate social geometries in the classroom. Joshua, I'm going to hand it over to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here today. And incredibly grateful for this conference just as an opportunity for people to share what works for them in the online education community. As was said, my name is Josh Friedman. I'm currently a PhD student studying cognitive science and education, and specifically teacher-student relationships and how they affect communication and learning in the classroom. So through that, I try to understand how do we improve these relationships or structure relationships between teachers and students, or between students and themselves, or students and the class as a whole, in order to improve learning and facilitate thinking in the classroom. I'm going to go ahead and start by sharing my screen and get to some slides. But in these first initial moments, if you're watching at home or just joining us now, I'd love for you to take a moment and just sort of maybe jot down on a piece of paper in front of you, or think to yourself, why here? Why come to this session? Why did you decide that this sounded good? What occurred to you, or what inspired you? And just sort of think, why am I here? And go ahead and answer that for yourself for a moment. I'll give you about 20 to 30 seconds to do so. Okay, and go ahead and continue those thoughts if you're still in the middle of them. That's totally fine. We're going to move into the presentation now. You should be able to see my slides, I'm pretty sure, but please shout out if that is not the case.
They look great.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We are going to jump right in. A lot of us have felt a little bit different, a little bit removed in these last couple of years from what we typically know to be education in the classroom. Here, as we can see, the teacher may stand at the front of the room. There's smiles on people's faces. They're interacting in person. You can see a raised hand quite easily. You can even sort of interact in the space outside the classroom if there's passing collaborators, people, friendly fellow students or teachers. It's a very sort of open environment, in other words, and it's an immediate environment for everybody all the time. I can see all of the people, I can feel all the people. There's a lot of information going on. However, in the last couple of years, a lot of us have gotten used to a very different environment where there is a very different set of information. There is still a lot of information, but it is a very different set of information. And what we mean by this is there's a whole lot of sort of nonverbal information at the same time from everyone. There isn't a sort of balancing act where only one person is talking, or only a few people are talking, or only a few people are looking at one other person. Everybody's always looking at everybody, and it can be overloading. On top of that, this image here might be a sort of ideal scenario where everybody is facing forward, they're making eye contact, their body is in full view of the camera, they look to be paying attention and engaged with whatever the speaker happens to be saying. However, I imagine a number of us are used to some messier scenarios on Zoom over the last couple of years where it's not so clear. People might be looking off into the side. They might be on phones or laptops. They all sorts of different devices, and they may be directly paying attention, or they may be multitasking with many other things in the background. In addition to that, they may be sort of even absent, or there's a sort of this weird in between where people choose the kind of rate at which they participate in real time. And while that's true of in-person environments as well, if I sit quietly to myself in person, people can still see my face. They can still hear if I exhale or inhale deeply, something like this, instead of being blocked off entirely. I just want to take a moment. Miranda, I believe you're not muted. If you wouldn't mind, get people to do that. Here we go. There we go. Okay, sorry about that, Miranda, but feel free to jump back in when we have a participatory time. So a lot of times, right, like this is what it looks like. This is a bit of a messier scenario. So the question that I really want to answer for us today is, when we engage in messier social scenarios and things are not as clear, what explicit social communication can we engage in? What tools are available to us on a social layer to be able to engage in an intellectual one, right? And getting to the task at hand. So a little bit before we get into that about me, why is it that I'm here standing at the front of the room? Real quickly, I grew up at summer camps and absolutely loved the sort of natural, organic education that I received there. Everything that I do today is based on what I learned at summer camp in a very core and foundational way, and in a way that my 12 years at public school could not have possibly prepared or informed me for. A big part of that reason is, as you saw in that first image, a big part of public school is sort of 24 kids sitting in neat, nice rows facing forward and listening to one person. And while there are plenty of moments in our life where that is in fact a social environment, it may not be the best social environment for every individual in that set of 24 rows of chairs, right? To be able to engage and develop and learn on their own terms. So I started wondering what's going on in the brain in this situation in public school, or in school kind of more formally or generally as we think of it, versus these more informal education environments like summer camp, after school programs, scouting, camping, whatever it may be. And that led me to say, well, let me just sort of figure out what everybody is doing. I decided I wanted to become a teacher, and in order to be a great teacher, I needed to be a great learner. So I decided to go learn around the world. I've lived, taught, and traveled on 5 different continents, and I'm hoping to get to 6 and 7 at some point in my life. But I went around trying to engage with people at educational institutions that were common or standard in their country and learn about how they guided their practice. And I used that to consider, how ideally should we be doing this whole thing called teaching, and what does it mean for the students that are trying to learn? I am now, through that journey, arrived, as I said, at this PhD program, collecting research and studying on a very, very detailed and deep level what happens in the brain when there is a good, positive relationship between teachers and students, and what happens when that relationship isn't going so well. So today's map, we're going to touch just for a brief moment on why it matters, why we're here, what's the point of being here. Then we're going to have a quick overview of the model as a whole that I'd like to present to you. Then we're going to look at it on the group level. And I want to really emphasize this. One of the key components of ICBCI is the fact that as a facilitator of learning, as a teacher in a classroom or a guide for a professional workshop, whatever it may be, the goal of this model and its implementation and use is that you as a facilitator can have an awareness of both what's happening in the group and what's happening in each individual with a common framework. So often we think, what does my class need? Long-term, big-term, abstract, and what does Johnny need, or what does Susie need? And we then go into particulars and individuals and things like this. ICBCI puts both of those conversations on the same game board and allows you to move very flexibly between them. So first we'll look at ICBCI on the group level. Then we'll, some of you may be familiar with this, take a quick dive into the cold experiential learning cycle and Dan Siegel's river of integration theory very briefly to help us understand how does ICBCI operate on the individual level. And then finally, we'll go to conclusions, recommended uses, and ways to practice. And there'll be a couple different opportunities to practice using the theory and the model as we go through the next 50 minutes or so as well. So why it matters, humans adapt not to the 3D or even the 4D in time environment, but to the social one, the being one itself, right? We don't have to think about, I need food, I need shelter, I need water. We get all of those things from other people. So how do we adapt to those people down to the classroom level? In the classroom, an inherently social environment, students can't learn if that primary environment, the social one, is imbalanced. Try to engage in a task when the social environment around you is disruptive or chaotic or wants your attention. It's impossible, right? I would argue that the best method to date to balance individuals and groups in this social environment is a synthesis of group dynamics, experiential learning, and what's called integrative neurobiology theory. And that comes from Dan Siegel, as I mentioned earlier. Again, we'll briefly touch on these. You cannot learn, you cannot engage in that task if the social environment is not supporting it. So what do we know about social environments? Well, we know groups develop. Newly formed groups look one way, and in more advanced groups, groups that have spent a lot of time together, groups that have solved a lot of problems together, they look very differently. So how do you get from the picture on the left to the picture on the right in the context of education? That's what we're going to talk about today. This development can happen in a balanced or an unbalanced fashion, right? We can have the group expend itself for the purpose of the individual, be it the teacher or a particularly A student or a particularly F student at any one particular time, or we can address the needs of the A student and the F student and the teacher and everybody in between all at the same time. That would be balanced. How does that happen? What does it mean to be balanced? I define it as the state of group relationships and attitudes that enable productive individual contribution to and reimbursement for group support for its members and the overall purpose of that group. For example, the group's purpose may be, we're in a geometry class and we need to teach a geometry thing. Each of those members, the students and the teacher, should be able to both contribute and get reimbursed for their contribution to the group. Right? That's the state of balance. Unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time, individual action and thought is actually primed by group support. We are what we eat. We are also who we interact with, who we be together with, who we see as ourselves or not ourselves. So what we experience, think about, choose, and commit to are strongly moderated by our relationship to the present social group, whether that's physically present, mentally present, emotionally present. It could be across many of these dimensions. What ICVCI argues, and we're going to touch on these 4 balance tools throughout this entire presentation, is that we can increase that group balance through explicit communication, negotiation, and importantly, very importantly, consensus between each individual and the group around ICVCI's 4 balance tools. They are called purpose, norms, goals, and meaning. Okay, and these things you may have seen these things before, heard of them in different ways. ICVCI attempts to capture them all at once and make it a coherent process that you can plan for and facilitate through. This is all of those images standing alone, but we know that this is a more complex and dynamic process. So metaphorically speaking, your norms set the space of your group activity. Your purpose remains your central sort of touch point. Why are we here? Why are we here? What are we doing? And your goals map out those little spots along the way that you happen to be going. And then throughout the entire process, everybody involved is constantly appraising. What does this mean to me? What does this mean to me? What does this mean to me? It's what we do as humans, is to constantly establish, why does this matter to me? What is the meaning? And the attempt here is to provide tools that help that meaning congeal, kind of coalesce around a central group purpose that each individual purpose is integrated into. Okay, now that's a lot of like, whoa, but we're going to break it down and we're going to make it concrete. Okay, finally, last bit on here in terms of main principles. Leaders, that's us as teachers and facilitators of groups, shift group potential through galvanizing perspective. right? When people lead groups, we notice those leaders more so than any other individual in the group. And leaders change. You don't always have the same leader for that group over time, but whoever's leading in that moment, in whatever way they happen to be leading, all of a sudden becomes highly important, highly salient to the group and its activity. We need to be aware of that and pay attention to that so that we can guide group development as we saw earlier. So just to get some background and a bit of a baseline, what does group development look like? Well, since 1965, the sort of dominant model has been that groups go through 4 processes, basically. Okay, I mean, there are adaptations and people have added things to this to kind of give some appreciation to some different aspects, but these are the big ones, right? So people talk about forming. When a group first gets together, everybody walks in the room, says, hello, how are you? Oh, who is that person? Who's that person? Why are we all here? Okay. Then groups tend to storm, so to speak, the argument goes, okay? They find out things that they disagree on and they have to decide who's right and who's wrong. And they do that apparently through norming processes, right? Through deciding we care about this, we value that, we don't value that other thing. And here's what we're gonna agree on in order to enable us to get work done. And then once we have those norms, we're able to perform. We're able to actually get that work done. Right. Now, ICBCI is not entirely revolutionizing these 4 ideas, but it is restructuring them so that it is, I think, closer to what is actually going on in groups. And that'll become apparent as we go through this. So instead of forming, so to speak, I call this stage introduction, right? We are introducing ourselves. We're perceiving externally what's around us as we introduce ourselves to the environment. We say, what do I need here? What's going on? What's salient in my environment? And instead of storming, I refer to this idea of conflict. We're going to come into a conflict with each other. We're going to collide, right? And that can be a really, really good, productive conflict. And it can also be a really messy, chaotic, unpleasant experience. In the middle, and we're going to come back to this, is what I call balance. And this sort of takes the place of what Tuckman viewed as norming. And there's a reason that this circle is bigger and in the middle of the others. And we're going to continue to dive into the meaning behind that as we go through the presentation. Instead of performing, I think about this as creation. We create all kinds of things: moments, experiences, products, projects, grades, memories, outcomes, whatever they may be. We're creating a whole lot of things in the activities that we do in the classroom and outside of it. And so this takes the place of performing. And there is something that is so valuable and important, as I mentioned earlier, that I don't think Tuckman had a very decent appreciation for, and that is a process of identity, a process of identifying what in that environment is important, that I want to remember, that I want to consolidate and be able to retrieve later. In other words, again, what does this mean to me? And how can I categorize this for use later on? Right. So sometimes it gets called, sometimes people have referred to adjourning, a sort of ending a group. And I don't, it's not just ending, right? We walk away with something. We walk away with an appraisal. And really importantly here, I want to just contrast this image that we're seeing now with the image we saw before, where there's this idea of a linear progression from one stage to another. The point that I want to make with ICBCI, one of the points is that this is a very dynamic process. It is not necessary that first you introduce and then you go into conflict and then you go into creation and then you go, and we jump around across the circle in all sorts of ways. And it is not always clean and orderly in our development. And sometimes we get interrupted in the middle of a conflict and we think, why are we even fighting about this anyway? And all of a sudden we're in identity again. And we're thinking, where's our purpose? We're trying to rebalance ourselves. ICBCI is able to not only accommodate that, but as a facilitator, give you a sort of perceptual tool to look out for it, right? All right, so this is where I would like to take a moment to go into a bit of a pair and share. I see that we have two participants here. I don't know if you guys would like to turn on your videos or your sound and sort of chat. But this is sort of the interactive piece. But we can just sort of touch on this and say, you know, if you have a moment later, keep this in mind and come back to it. I'm also going to share a set of slides. This is a slide deck that will basically put all of this in a place where you can interact with it freely on your own. So you can, there's a worksheet and you can just sort of fill in the blank and go with that. But I don't know if we want time here or if I should just move on. But here's what I'll say. If any of those spheres, any of those types of activity occurred to you, is that, oh, wow, thinking as a teacher, that's a moment I've seen in the classroom. I know what introduction looks like in the classroom. I know what creation looks like in the classroom. So if you feel inspired, go ahead and answer one of those questions on the screen. And if not, we can move on. It's okay too.
Well, it's been a while since I've been in class, but definitely I'm just reading here from the what happened in the creative atmosphere when we would have our teachers, you know, break us out to do little I had teachers who would always think that it was easier, and for me it personally is, to do something hands-on, and we would, you know, create a skit together or something and have to work, and that was always quite difficult with people that you didn't work with, right?
Yeah.
You have one goal but a lot of different ways to get there and a lot of different voices and identities to work with.
Yeah, and it's true of almost every group, right? We can imagine, you know, the most alike group possible, where everybody's the same age and the same gender and from the same neighborhood and has the same toys at home and likes the same subject in school and wants to be the same thing when they grow up. And even then, I'm sure that we can make them get in a fight if we really want to, right? So because they want to create this and they want to create that and they want to create that, and when we say, hey, go create, without any kind of social scaffolding around it, we can end up going in too many directions at once and essentially nowhere, right? So thank you for that. So it's a great example of why this can be really important and really important.
Can you guys hear me at all?
Yes, we can, Miranda. Thank you. Welcome.
Oh, good. I was just going to say, and I'm not sure if this is the right type of discussion, but I was just going to, or feedback, but I was going to say, what I've noticed in, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were in my, one of my jobs with a nonprofit, we're being put in lots of groups, lots of committees. You know, we had a committee to, you know, figure out how we were going to deal with the pandemic. And what happened was, I found in a lot of these committees that we were kind of all of a sudden being asked to participate in, is that there were the group norms and expectations weren't really set properly. And people were very confused about what their roles were in the group. And so I feel like that is an important thing, is establishing roles within the group, because I really did experience that recently in one group I specifically was part of. And the leader or the organizer of the group didn't quite give enough instruction. And so that the group norms and expectations, I think, are very, very important. Like, what is the goal of this?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's something that we often overlook just naturally, because we already, as the real tough thing psychologically as teachers and facilitators is that we have designed the entire experience in our heads already. We know all the things, we know what's supposed to happen, but we've just imagined it. And we haven't communicated it to anybody. And it's really difficult sometimes to distill what are the essential pieces of information that this group actually needs in order to create the experience that I've imagined, right? So we go around assuming everybody can read my mind and they don't need any kind of supports or anything like that. They'll just do what I say and then it'll work. Right. And so I love that you said this, Miranda, because a big goal of mine is to turn, I'm talking about every single classroom teacher, every single period of the day, right, that has in mind is my purpose for this period? What are the norms for this period? What's everybody's individual goals and roles? We're going to touch on that. It's a really, really great point. And how are we going to establish, create, and agree on meaning? Right, and through those sorts of activities, we hopefully, as best as possible, as much as possible, not only create more inclusive and equitable education spaces, because there'll be opportunities for the entire class to engage in that norming process instead of here are your expectations. Right, we can say what are our norms for the class period, which is a huge change. Right, and so just have those 4 things in your head. How do I, and now we can get to work. Right, is a really key piece. Thank you so much for that, Miranda. All right, we're going to move forward for the sake of time, but thank you so much for that participation. I really appreciate it. Up here are just some examples of what these might look like, right? So what does introduction look like both in the classroom and outside of it, right? These sorts of orientations, bios, icebreakers, mixers, perceptions. What does conflict look like? All kinds of challenges, personality clashes, argumentation, maybe debates, right? Things I'm not jiving with what's going on right now. I need to think internally, like I need to fix something and work it out. What does balance look like? What balancing acts are all about, as we've talked about. What are the rules and expectations, right? Tell me what we're doing. Brief me on what's about to happen. A full value contract is an idea of everybody coming together and agreeing. What do we value in this classroom, right? Well, we value listening and active listening. So we're going to agree to listen with the goal of asking a good question and not responding with an argumentative statement, right? So we might set some goals and say, okay, what do we want to do? We might tell stories, kind of congeal or build group identity, right? So there's all kinds of different ways that we might socially balance our classrooms and our groups so that everybody's on the same page. These are all suggestions for that. Creations could be everything. It's like experiences, memories, products, projects, decisions, right? All kinds of things that we do something internally first. We feel, okay, now this is what I want to do and affect in reality, right? That's that creation moment. And then finally, we've done something. What does that mean for us? What do we reflect, right? We have epiphanies. We integrate different concepts together and we say, these things are coherent, right? And symbiotic, this will work, right? Something I also term internal perception. Okay, so these are examples of these different stages. Now, if you'll notice, right, like purpose, norms, all the things we've been talking about, it's not on the board anywhere. And why? Right? Well, because these things are going to happen. You as a facilitator, you as a teacher are not going to say, hey guys, we're not going to have conflict today. And then nobody's going to have conflict, right? That's impossible. These are the things that are guaranteed, right? This is going to happen. This is already happening, whether you like it or not, in an incredibly dynamic way. This is the elephant. That's what's on the screen right now. What we're going to talk about going forward is, what are the reins that we have to guide that elephant, right? So transition between these stages can happen in what I consider, again, a balanced. In other words, from introduction to conflict, we move through balance, or we move unbalanced. We move from introduction to conflict out of balance, right? An example of this might be, okay, we get into the classroom and I notice over there's that person that I really don't like. We've been in classes together before. They've bullied me and I've run away from them, and it's just not really been good. And an unbalanced way to handle that situation might be to, menacingly grab my pencil and make a very threatening sort of stance to try to scare them off, right? That might be unbalanced to go into that conflict with. But a balanced way might be to say, listen, hey, a person that I've had really real challenges with before, I don't want to have those challenges again, right? How can we talk? How can we discuss? How can we set rules, expectations, norms for us, just us maybe, right? That we can get along. That would be very balanced before we go into that conflict, because we know we're going to clash. And we decide when we clash, we're going to use I statements so that we don't make assumptions of other people and what they're thinking, right? We're going to actively listen so that we don't listen to respond, we listen to understand, right? So these are norms that we can agree on as we move into conflict to be able to better handle all the conflicts that we are going to engage in, right? And this is a group process, right? This is happening on a group level and an individual one. We're going to start with the group level, okay? What does it mean for a group to move in a balanced way from introduction to conflict? It means that the group has norms, that we've written it up on the wall, that we've made expectations, that everybody said, this is what I care about, and this is what I care about, and we found Venn diagram meeting in the middle sort of overlap, right? And we've come up with norms. If we're unbalanced, it's because we have no group norms. We haven't had this conversation at all, right? So anything could happen when we go into conflict. Similarly, as mentioned earlier by Miranda, we have group goals, right? Concrete steps, targets that we're going to say, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that. First, we're going to learn about geometry and how angles add up to 180 in a triangle. And then after we understand that, we're going to add 2 triangles and see how the inner angle and the outer angle add up to 180 as well. And then after that, we're going to concrete goals and steps that we agree on. Sometimes a group has no goals. It's not clear what we're creating. Everybody has a different goal in mind that they're all going for, as was mentioned earlier. Additionally, a way to increase balance from creation to identity, right, is that the group has an opportunity to establish meaning as a whole group together, right? And say, oh, this means this to me. Say, oh, that doesn't mean that thing to me. This is what it meant to me. And all of a sudden now we have these 2 perspectives that we can see what actually was reality instead of just one person's reality. We can make it very explicit and clear what's going on in the group. And once we have a very clear idea of what's going on in the group, we can have that appraisal, say, oh, this is a group that learns well together. This is the best math class I've ever been in. That's creating that group meaning. Sometimes we don't have that group meaning. We don't have, in fact, I would argue most of the time, there are very few classes in operation today. There are more and more every day, which is really amazing. But there are very few, on the whole, classes operating today that have a moment to say, what does this all mean to us individually and as a group? One of the simplest examples of this is that instead of saying at the end of an activity, raise your hand if you have something to say about what just happened. Whoever speaks first in that moment, or whoever speaks most assertively after that person, right? That's where the group identity is going to go. But if instead, crazy notion, the teacher or the facilitator prompts everybody to first individually think for themselves. What does this mean to you? Write it down on a piece of paper. And now talk with your partner about what it means to both of you. And now talk in a group of 4, and now a group of 8. And now let's talk as a whole class. And imagine the difference in depth of that experience versus the one where we as teachers and facilitators say, this means that, right? That becomes the student's choice to accept or reject. And that's kind of it. That's where it ends. You've already won them over already, or you haven't. There's no learning there, right? So giving opportunities for individual meaning to be generated and to contribute to group meaning is what links that social fabric together, what helps us integrate with each other and identify together. And once we identify together, we all of a sudden have this amazing capability to envision purpose. The purpose of this group is to teach me geometry. The purpose of this group is to make our neighborhood cleaner, because we meet up every week and we pick up the trash on the side of the road. When our groups don't have purpose, when they don't, and I want to be very careful to make sure that I highlight that purpose leads into introduction. So it's not just that we finish with purpose, we also begin with purpose. That is an incredibly powerful balancing tool. Simon Sinek has one of the most famous TED Talks that's been watched in the history of TED Talks. It's just start with the why. Start with the why, start with your purpose. It doesn't work just on a marketing level, it works because it's socially real in our primary reality, right? All right. So what are these things, right? So purpose, the overall reason or rationale for being and doing, it answers the question, why, as mentioned earlier. Norms, what are they? They're the commitments that we make to act in particular ways, right? They answer the question of how. Goals, what are they? They are specific and concrete targets to guide action. They answer the question of what. And meaning, it is the most significant associations in thought between what is happening now and how it affects us. And that's us as an individual, and it's us as in us as a group. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying this operates on a group and an individual level. This is something that we need in order to think and process through a task. And it's something that we need as a whole group to think through and to process a task, right? All right, so this is our second opportunity for interaction and engagement. If anything has occurred to you, I would love, we don't need to spend 12 whole minutes on this, but I would love if anything occurred to you in terms of norms, purpose, goals, meaning, briefly consider it and think about how that tool is present or absent from your classroom, right? And once you've done that, I want you to think about how might you include it where it's missing? And if it's there, but it's like implicit or it's told to the students, how can we make it explicit? How can we make it inclusive? And how can we make it communicated, right? On the surface. Does anybody have any thoughts around these questions? The floor is open.
So one of the things in the nonprofit that I work with, there's been a lot of staff learning recently, especially since last summer and the start of the Black Lives Matter protests. So there's been lots of staff learning around DE&I, also the inclusion of safe spaces in the workplace, and I sometimes think maybe the purpose hasn't been explicitly stated, and sometimes it is. I mean, sometimes it's very, like let's work together to be better allies, and I find there's a lot more engagement because I think, especially a lot of people I find sort of glaze over, in these kind of in these learning opportunities. And I think if there are moments of self-reflection included in the and personal stories, that seems to be very effective in this specific learning, in this learning in this way. But I feel like if everyone feels included, and that can be through how are you coming at this subject, and if it's in the classroom, if it's something like math, where are you at? And if everyone can check in, and if there's space included for that, I think that's very helpful. Check in person, how do you connect with the material personally? Yeah, I don't know if that if that's relevant.
It's totally relevant. It's totally relevant. Let me see if I can contextualize it a bit in this conversation, right? So yes, we all come not only with entirely different personal histories, right, but entirely different kind of just like present state attitudes. Sometimes I get a good night's sleep, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I get my caffeine in the morning, and sometimes I don't, right? And so there are moments where we are more prepared or less prepared for what's going on in front of us, no matter what happens to be going on in front of us. And when those things that are going on in front of us are particularly challenging, personal, make us feel vulnerable in some way, right? And anti-racist education is an incredible example of this that's happening worldwide in education right now, in sort of combating and debating and over how do I fit into this? In many ways, anti-racism is this incredible, it's not a new concept, right? But it's become an incredibly current and important concept because of how many different problems it kind of collects under its umbrella with this solution of like, let's practice anti-racism. We can solve a whole lot of things going on if we practice anti-racism. But that topic in and of itself is such an individualized kind of thing where I need to reflect on my beliefs. I need to reflect on my own conditioning. I need to reflect on my own upbringing and my own environments. And all these challenges, we're going to talk about this balance between external challenge coming at me and sort of internal actualization that's kind of pushing against that challenge, right? And what we find is that if we want people to engage in actualization, these tools are going to set them up to do so, right? These tools are going to set them up in a space where they are in what we call their learning zone. Instead of their comfort zone, where they don't have to confront those biases and those beliefs and that conditioning, right? Or in their panic or their danger zone, where they're being so overwhelmingly confronted that it's a traumatic experience and that we react with fighting and we react with hostility and we react with, let me keep my self-concept intact because I don't appreciate you calling me a racist, right? So the idea here is like, again, that social layer comes first. And that social layer includes me, includes how I feel right now, right? And so the idea is, if I can dig in to how am I feeling right now? What is the meaning of my bodily sensations going on? What is the meaning of this sort of tension that I feel in my own mind about who am I, right? Is to bring those pieces out and make them explicit in the process of education, make them negotiable in the process of education. Again, it says here, how do we make them explicit, and how will the students receive or respond, right? Like, how do we make this a collaborative enterprise where each of those individuals with their individual stories can come and say, this is where I'm at, this is what I want to accomplish, and what I believe I can accomplish. This is what I need help with. All of these conversations can happen in the process of identifying purpose and establishing norms and then setting goals, right? It makes it more negotiable. And I think that's so core and so important when we think of groups of people learning together. Just because one person has read 14 different books on anti-racism and they're in the room, it doesn't mean that one person who has never heard the term before is ready to like learn and engage as deeply as this other person is. But we can still figure out how to help people learn on their own terms. And that's the idea here. Again, how has each individual got an opportunity to identify their purpose? Has each individual got an opportunity to identify their norms, right? So, anti-racism topic can be a very sensitive and difficult thing. So I want to give everybody an opportunity right now for when they feel aroused or when they feel vulnerable or when they feel hurt, here's like, I want you to think about, how are you going to respond? How do you want to respond? Let's set individual norms for behavior. And now that we have those individual norms, let's come out to group norms. And this process can be done in 5-10 minutes. It really can be. It's just about noticing the opportunity to do so, right? So I really appreciate that. I'm gonna move on again, just so that we can start to see that individual group crossover. Okay. So here's what we looked at before, right? We either have them or we don't, and it's balanced or it's not. But what about the individual? Well, to get a sense of that, I want to take us through a couple individualized processes to give us an example of what we're going for here. So one, the Kolb experiential learning cycle suggests that first we actively, well, it's a cycle, but we got to pick some part of the circle to start on. So first we actively experiment, right? We just do something, okay? I wonder what'll happen if I drop this ball on the ground. And then we have a concrete experience. We see, the ball fell from my hand and it dropped on the ground and it made a little dent in the dirt. Okay, that's what happened. Now I know what happened. And then I can reflectively observe, what does that mean for this ball and that ground? Well, it might mean that the ball is heavier or denser or harder, or the ground is softer or flexible, whatever that may mean. I'm reflecting on it. I'm trying to assign meaning to what's going on in front of me. And then I'm going to like abstractly conceptualize is what they call it, but it essentially means, right, like integrating that meaning into future opportunity, future models, future predictions of the world, right? So, oh, that must mean that the next time that I drop this ball like this from my hand and it goes down to the ground, it'll make a dent in the ground again. And now I have a model for action of cause, effect. And we do this over and over and over again. An example of this in the classroom. We might be talking about, hey, we're all going to start our reading period, right? And somebody's trying to decide between the level 3 book and the level 4 book. And can I do the level 4? How would I do the level 4? Well, I'm probably going to read slower. I'm probably going to get more upset with myself. But I might learn. I would learn something though. It might be good. I don't know. Well, here goes nothing. Let me try it, right? And all of a sudden I realize I'm doing it. I'm reading. I'm actually getting through. Something's happening. This is exciting, right? And then now that I've done it, that felt like I knew more words than I thought I was going to, or I knew a lot less than I thought I was going to. I'm really not ready for number 4. I need to go back to number 3, right? And so then we have this conversation about, now this time I'm going to X, Y, or Z. That's the process of learning. That's that cycle over and over and over again. What's going on in our minds, how our brains work, right? How does this operate in the model we've discussed so far? Well, we try something when we introduce ourselves to a situation, to a task, to a challenge or conflict. When we're engaging with that conflict, right? We're doing things. We're moving from okay, we solved the problem that we couldn't get started because of. We hadn't identified our goals. We hadn't got, we hadn't said, okay, this is what we actually want to do, or this is what we're actually disagreeing on, and get through that conflict, right? So we create. After we create, we reflect, right? And sort of move into that identity process. Consider, what does this mean for me, right? And then we plan. Okay, we plan, we identify an opportunity, we identify a purpose for this meaning that we've established. The next time I will know what's going to happen if I drop the ball. So I can plan for situations where I want to drop the ball and situations where I don't want to drop the ball, right? Each time we do this, each time we go around the cycle, our capacity, our ability to handle that object, to know its meaning, to engage and use it in other models and other predictions and other creations increases. As a positive reinforcement loop over and over and over again, increasing our capacity. While we're doing this, we can do it in a couple of different ways, okay? We can engage in this process in what is referred to as a very rigid way, with a whole lot of rules, not a lot of change, very static. We decided 6 months ago when we got into this classroom, these were the rules and expectations, and these are the rules and expectations from now until the end of time, right? Or we could do it chaotically. We could never have established rules and expectations. We could have never called these things out explicitly. We could just leave it up to whatever is going to happen, and it's just going to happen. And this would be incredibly chaotic and unproductive in most cases. What we want to think about is being in the river, right in the middle of that river, where we are integrating structure or rigidity with flexibility or chaos. It is finding the best of both worlds that we want to be thinking about when we're thinking socially. How do we help advance this learning for the individual and for the group? How do we balance ourselves between being too rigid, too stuck, and being too wild, too free, right? What's that balance? And this balance exists in our nervous system, down to the neurons. We get aroused and we get settled. And these are two different functions. Our arousal increases that chaos. Our settling says, whoa, whoa, take a break, deep breath, stop, sit, wait, stand here, freeze. Our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous systems balance us and keep us in equilibrium to continue going. And there are many different examples of this rigid, chaotic balance across contexts. So given those tools, what does that individual process look like? Well, we can be balanced, as mentioned before. We can have norms, and we can commit to those norms as an individual. So the group has established norms, that's the group level, and the individual, on the individual level, needs to commit to those norms, to try them and to say, I'm willing to do that. And I may mess up, I may screw it up, but you know what? When I screw it up, I'm gonna know that I screwed it up because I'm trying to do this, right? And I know whether or not I did that. But what happens if the individual doesn't commit to norms? They might withdraw from the group activity in a very rigid way, say, I'm not going to participate. I'm going to stay only me, only an individual. You can't touch me, right? Or they might say, I don't like what your purpose is. I don't like what you're doing or you're up to. I want you to do what I want to do. I want this group to be under my control, under my influence. And so they'll chaotically, me, right? Similarly, when we're thinking about moving from conflict to creation, we have goals established on the group level. The individual, on the individual level, shares those goals. And another way of saying it might be believing in them or committing to them, chasing them. And incredibly importantly, thank you, Miranda, for mentioning this earlier, they hold a role in the completion of that process, right? In the completion of that goal, they know what their responsibility is. These are the things that we want to look out for the individual. If they don't, they might hold on to that conflict and they can't move past it, right? Or they might choose a role and a goal that just is absolutely disharmonic with the rest of the group. I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and I'm going to work on this thing, and you guys do whatever you want to do. I don't want to be a part of your group, right? Because they haven't been given a role that is meaningful to them, right? They have, or they don't share that goal that we're looking for them to engage in, right? Similarly, after we create something, we want a group to have a group meaning. What does that require? It requires that the individuals in that group integrate that meaning into their own. Just because you think we did a really great job doesn't mean I have to think we did a really great job. But if you think we did a really great job and I think we really did a really poor job, and we talk to each other and we integrate our meanings into the group, we'll probably have a much more accurate picture of the job that we actually did, right? So we want all of those individuals to get an opportunity to integrate that meaning, right? That's part of that negotiation process. But what happens if they don't? They might be just invulnerable or closed, rigidly saying, you group, I don't want you to affect me, right? I want to be a soccer player and you're all basketball players, and basketball players don't know anything about the kind of athletics and athleticism that a soccer player needs to know about. So I don't think you have anything to share with me, right? Alternatively, they might say, oh, no, the bananas. They might just chaotically kind of contribute a meaning that is, maybe it's personal to them, maybe it's real, maybe it's just ridiculous, but also maybe it's like so far-fetched that everybody's like, how on earth did you come away with that meaning? And maybe this is an opportunity to notice what did this person miss? What aren't they getting? Right? This is about, in a sense, right? This is about like getting the data and saying, okay, this individual got that and this individual didn't get that. And what were the differences in these individuals' experiences and how I, as a facilitator, created those experiences, right? Do individuals have an opportunity to integrate their personal meaning in a meaningful way? Finally, for our purpose, right? An individual is either, we have a group purpose, and an individual is either going to envision opportunities for that purpose. This is the greatest math class I've ever been a part of. I can't wait to go tomorrow because I'll get better at math. That's an opportunity for that person. All of a sudden they believe in it and they're envisioning that next time they go to the classroom and learning about math. Instead of envisioning that's the next time I'm going to go be rambunctious with my friends and not be in your math learning group. I'm going to be in my social fun group where I don't care about math, right? We want our individual students to be thinking about what are the opportunities for these learning experiences we're engaging in. But if they don't, it might be because they don't believe in the group purpose, in which case, again, in the case of the anti-racism discussion, becomes an opportunity to say, where does that lack of belief or disbelief in anti-racist practices come from? Right? This creates an opportunity for explicit, open, trustworthy reflection and engagement and integration with the whole group. Or they might not understand the group purpose. They might have no idea, why are we doing this? And this, again, is another data point that says, did we identify this? Did we spend time to actually dig deep into this so that every member of the group can understand the group purpose, right? We want to be aware of that. All right, so given these, again, we go in this circle, in this cycle, and it's not linear. It's not definitely you're going to go from one to the other, but I'm suggesting that that is the strongest structure for creating the outcomes we want to see, for increasing the capacities of our groups, so that if we move in balanced ways from introduction to conflict, in other words, with norms, and we move from conflict to creation in a balanced way, in other words, with goals and roles clearly established, from creation to identity with meaning, not just said, but truly individualized, in other words, differentiated and then integrated, linked together. Each individual gets a chance for meaning, and the group as a whole gets to benefit from those individual meanings. And from identity to introduction, we've identified another purpose. Or when we're just beginning, we've identified our purpose. And each time we complete that ring, we increase the sort of scope and the immensity of those purposes that we're able to tackle, right? And as we mentioned earlier, like in anti-racism, there are more difficult topics than others. Not every group is ready for every level of intensity or depth that a topic might offer. And so one of the strengths of having this model in our minds is thinking, is this group ready for this purpose? Is our capacity enough, wide enough, big enough, large enough, deep enough in order to handle this content? That is something that we are not often asking ourselves on a social level. We think about it on an intellectual one, right? Did they learn fractions before we learned to divide fractions, right? But there's no consideration for how did learning fractions go as a whole group in this group for each of those individuals? Are they experiencing stereotype threat, for example, right? And is that something that we need to dig into before we're able to truly deeply engage in learning to divide those fractions, right?
A little less than 1 minute left, Josh, so sorry.
Yep. No, it's totally fine. We are nearing towards the end. So in addition, on those slides that I just offered in the chat a while ago, I'll repost the link again so that everybody can see it. But here, these are there. Here are guiding questions that I would like us to have in mind as we're designing learning experiences, right? Have we identified that group purpose? What is it? Where will it be displayed? Have we discussed, negotiated, and agreed on norms for behavior as a class? Has each individual been given access, an inclusive opportunity to contribute to those norms? Are there values that may be distilled from the norms for further clarification, right? What goals have been set for the class, for each individual? Who decides those goals? Who has access to adapt them to student needs? Do they make clear what individual roles are available for students to play? And how is meaning decided in the class environment? Who contributes to appraising the meaning, or a moment of process? What meaning-making exercises are daily practices? And how will you provide space for individual meanings to gel and harmonize in a group meaning? And finally, though this, we're not gonna have a lot of time for this, but I'll quickly run through as a leader or a facilitator. ICBCI can also guide you in how you affect groups through thinking of yourself in the center and maintaining this balance along 4 axes. Those 4 axes are we acting or are we perceiving? Are we doing too much acting, throwing us out of balance, and not enough perceiving? How dependent versus independent are we? Is everything relying on me and my actions? Or do I have no idea what all the kids are actually doing on their own? Where do we find that middle ground? As I mentioned earlier, is this so challenging that we can't actually get to or engage in those identity processes? Right? Or is this an opportunity, or is this so actualizing? Is everybody like really fully self-expressing that there's no coherence in that actualization on the group level? And finally, Are we spending a whole lot of time predicting, saying what is and simulating? Or are we so busy in talking about what went wrong and how bad it was and everything else that we just get bogged down in conflict? How do we as leaders balance these axes through our own actions? So to summarize and finish up, ICBCI can serve two main functions: noticing those balance tools that are part of the facilitation of each individual and the group, and also for us as leaders, but also the leaders in our classrooms, how are they affecting group action through the guiding questions that are available on the slides that I shared before. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, anything else on the presentation, obviously my information is available on the WOVA app, and also here's my email as well.
Thank you all so much for joining us. And thank you so much, Josh Friedman. Josh's slides, as well as his handouts, are available on the Learning Conference site if you would like to take a look at those separately as well. And his email is right here. Thank you all so much. And we're going to jump into another stream.
Thanks.
Thank you.